This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Are you familiar with the Queenager? Defined as a woman of middle age or older who is entirely comfortable living a life as freely as a teenager, but with added experience, disposable income, autonomy. The time for the maturing woman is long overdue after centuries of dismissal by society and the labour market. And as the 21st century seems to be a curious time for reappraising what we mean by gender, by generation, by age, and by social capital. It is also a time when we no longer trust or believe in grand media narratives about how we are supposed to live our lives. In this episode of the Possibility Club, the practical bravery we're exploring is focused partly on the media industry and who holds the power to communicate social truths, and partly on the rise of women in their 40s and 50s who are using the internet and social media age to reclaim some of the spotlight. My guest's first job after university was working on a trade magazine about chemical storage, before rising through the male-dominated newspaper industry to great acclaim at The Observer, The Telegraph, The Times and The Sunday Times, where she was the magazine editor and the paper's editorial director. As well as being a prolific campaigner on the representation and recognition of women in journalism, my guest founded the company Noon in 2021, a community for older women and Queenagers, the demographic that the media forgot. I'm Richard Freeman, and it is a delight to invite you into my Possibility Club chat with Eleanor Mills. Well, hello. Welcome to the Possibility Club. It's Richard Freeman here. As usual, I'm looking at change, impact, the future. I'm looking at practical bravery, and I have a very special guest with whom I'm going to explore all of that through a particular lens. Now, my guest in this episode is a prolific journalist, not just a journalist, but a kind of journalist's journalist, and as a trainer and a mentor to many others. He's a campaigner doing a huge amount to embolden and empower women at different sort of stages of their life cycle, I guess, which is something I'm really keen to explore. And is the sort of missing link in her interview career between people like the Dalai Lama, Sheryl Sandberg, and David Cameron, who probably only otherwise have, a love of Coldplay in common. But here we have somebody who's interviewed all of them and is able to get the best out of the people she talks to. So it's very odd for me that the tables have turned and I'm interviewing such a profound interviewer. But there we go. We'll see how we get on. So my guest this week is Eleanor Mills. Ella, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Nice to be here. What a lovely intro.
And where are you calling in from?
I'm in sunny Kentish Town in North London. I can see the trees of the heath from my office. The birds are tweeting outside. Hope that doesn't affect the sound. And yeah, it's kind of evening. It's quite pleasant. Delightful.
Well, maybe let's start with some of the big things that you're doing at the moment. So kind of Noon. And what's a Queenager?
What's a Queenager? One of my favourite questions. So everything that I'm trying to do now is to tell a different story about the later stages of women's lives. So a Queenager for me is a way of kind of rebranding that space, what we might call the age of becoming. Loosely, a Queenager is kind of 45 to 70, I think. I'm quite careful about not putting too many age limits on it because there are older ones who go, but I want to be a Queenager, and then younger ones who go, I think I'm a Queenager. So I think a Queenager is really about embracing that midlife pivot. And there's a wonderful book called The 100-Year Life. Mm-hmm. And in The 100-Year Life, 50 is only halfway through, which is why I called my new platform for women Noon, as in the middle of the day, noon.org.uk. And it's all about trying to tell the stories of a new pioneering generation of women who are hitting this point, the like of whom we have not seen before. In that I'm 52. I'm one of the kind of first generation of women to have worked all the way through since I left university, through having 2 children. We're really the kind of spearhead of the generation of women who entered the workforce in the same proportion as men, and who've worked all the way through and had those kind of careers which really had been the preserve of men before that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's there in the statistics. I'm a journalist. I'm interested in facts, though people may find that surprising because of some journalism these days. And in the 2019 census, women over 40 started earning more money than women under 40 for the first time ever.
Wow.
And I think that that's a really interesting shift. So there's a whole new kind of midlife woman out there who I call a queenager, because we did a big piece of research at Noon with the management consultants Accenture, where we did the biggest deep dive yet into women kind of 45 to 60. And one of them said, well, I feel like a teenager, but in my own house with pucker tea and nice sheets. So I really like that kind of concept of kind of going back into a real stage of transition, feeling like you're becoming a new version of yourself, but with quite a lot of experience and probably some more financial resources and, more of a sense of yourself and a lot of hard-won wisdom. And I spend quite a lot of time in Jamaica, where they talk about women as queens a lot. So I just like the two things. So we kind of thought Queenager was quite a fun bit of a rebrand. I think it's really important that although the menopause conversation is important, and we've had a lot of that, the whole point of feminism for me is that women are not defined by their biology.
Yeah, it's not just
I don't want to be put in a hot flush box now. I'm 52. And also menopause is a bit like pregnancy in that it's a nightmare when you're kind of going through it and it's all kind of quite all consuming. But actually it does pass and you move into a new phase. So I'm very keen to dub this point kind of queenagerhood, of which menopause is a kind of bit of that, rather than menopause being the whole story, because I think there's a real kind of hot pink flush brandification of older women as menopausal going on, which I don't like, and my women don't like either. 90% of the women that we survey don't want to be defined as menopausal at this point. So I think that's quite important. I mean, there's a massive bit of health inequity there. So, I mean, what people like Davina McCall have done and, the amazing MP Carolyn Harris and on putting menopause on the map, I think it's really important. It's important that doctors are trained in it. Thus far, it hadn't been mandatory to be trained. Women in the poorest parts of the UK get half the prescriptions for HRT as women in the richest parts. I mean, there's a huge health inequity there and then an intersectionality around all of that. So I'm not disputing any of that. And for the women who do have a horrible time, they need to be protected at work. But it's just to say that that's kind of one aspect of our lives. Yeah. And I think it's tended to dominate a bit too much. And I don't think women like it very much. And I think it can be weaponized against them, as we saw with the case of Nicola Bulley, that poor woman who fell in the river. And so I think women have to be careful that those things aren't used to put them back into that kind of Victorian stereotype of hysterical kind of women ruled by their wombs, kind of, not sentient. The Victorian view basically was that women were like animals or children, that they, because of their hormones, they were hysterical and therefore they couldn't kind of operate. So I just think as a good feminist, I'm just always a bit wary about those kind of biological.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, let's just stick them all in the sanatoriums in Surrey that looked, pretty from the outside, but horrific inside. But I guess that kind of sense when it's about pregnancy, when it's about the menopause, it's all couched in this idea of educating men, of getting men up to speed with what this is. Whereas actually kind of what you're talking about, which is about just kind of empowerment and taking space and having a voice and stuff, So I think, and certainly 25 years at the top or 30 years at the top of the British media has definitely made me see that the media is very much a male lens. When I was chair of Women in Journalism for 10 years, we used to talk about how the media needs to be a truly reflecting mirror, not a distorting lens. And I think that too often it's a distorting lens because of the people who are making the decisions. Yeah. And most of the decisions in the newspapers that people read every day, and not just in the newspapers, in the TV and on the radio, are made by a kind of backbench of old, posh white men. Mm-hmm. And therefore women get quite a tough time. So my kind of ultimate descriptor of this is I remember when Theresa May went to speak to Nicola Sturgeon about Brexit, and the front page of the Daily Mail the next day was, forget about Brexit, it's all about Legxit. Who's got the better legs, Theresa May or Nicola Sturgeon? And that for me was an absolute classic kind of male lens moment, because it's saying, doesn't matter how important you are, whether you're the leader of a nation, ultimately how you're going to be defined as a woman is by how sexy your legs are. So I'm all about
trying to make people aware of that lens and to kind of deconstruct it and say, we don't need to see ourselves through a prism through which the only things that women are valued for is being fecund and fertile, kind of hot and pregnant, and that it's really important that we see women as a kind of whole rainbow of things, of which their kind of fecundity and their fertility and their hotness and their fanciability are just two strands, and that we also really see their creativity and their intelligence and their competence and all those other things that they are too, and that too often in our culture I think we miss that, and women are taught to judge themselves very harshly because of that male lens. And so what I'm trying to do at Noon is to really tell things from a kind of female midlife point of view, which I don't think you get in the mainstream media. The statistics show at the moment, I think there are more companies being started by women over 50 than any other demographic. And also that we're twice as likely to be successful as younger entrepreneurs. And some of the companies which are the kind of unicorns or the kind of, the people who've really made a lot of money, all of them are over 40 when they start, and they come into it with quite a lot of experience from another life. So what I see all around me is women leaving corporates and setting up their own things. And I think that that's partly because at the top of business, it's still very much a kind of boys' club. And the higher you go, the more clearly, boysy it becomes in a way that I think it isn't now and in the kind of lower echelons. And I think that also you get to a point where you're just a bit sick of kind of playing the game. And there's a whole thing, I think, that when you're a kind of a professional woman about being quite pleasing, being quite pleasing to your boss, being quite kind of pleasing physically. So then they like having you around. And I think you get to a point and you're kind of, 45, 50, you've been doing it for 25, 30 years. And you're just like, I'm just not prepared to suck up to this kind of more senior guy to get my ideas round him, when actually I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm actually really good at my job. I know what I'm doing. I just can't be bothered to do the geisha thing anymore. And I've heard so many, I run this community of Queenagers, and I hear that over and over again, that they really now define success as being able to say no, being able to do things in their own way, feeling much more purposeful, having the flexibility to run their lives in the way that they want. I was the editor of the Sunday Times magazine, and one of my great friends is a woman called Tiffany Dark, used to edit the style section, and we bumped into each other at the Hampstead Heath Ladies Pond last week at kind of 11 o'clock on a Wednesday morning, and we're both running our own things and having a really good time, and still making good money, but we're not having to be at somebody else's beck and call from kind of 8 a.m. till 10 o'clock at night. I mean, those media jobs are pretty brutal. And I see that with lots and lots of women who are just like, no, this is my time now. I'm going to do it my way for me. And those at the top of those organisations, the culture hasn't really shifted enough for it to be a particularly nice place to be a senior woman. And women are leaving in droves. For every woman who's made a director, 2 leave. Sheryl Sandberg's dubbed it the great breakup. So there's a real problem at the top of business. If you think that of the 100 FTSE CEOs, 8 are women. In 2023. I mean, that's a very glacial change. I'm on the steering committee of the Global 30% Club, which, we could talk about the name. I think the 30% Club's a probably unambitious target, but that's still a kind of mirage in most places. And even though we now got quite a lot of women on boards, the number of women actually pulling levers is a lot less than the 40%, which is the headline figure, which is for non-executive directors. The reality is about 16%. So if all these senior women leave their organisations at 45, 50, you're never going to change that dynamic at the top. So I've been writing and talking about that for a very long time.
Arguably, you'll see the overall power of the big corporates start to diminish as the power shifts down into smaller, more nimble.
I think that's totally right. And I think that that's very much what we're seeing in media. I mean, we started off talking about, what are the changes that I've seen kind of in journalism. And I was the editorial director at the Sunday Times. So and what I find now is I now run my own little media company, but I'm basically using all the tricks that I knew running the Sunday Times, and you can run your own community and monetize it now. So it's Substack, game changer for people like me, because you can get your audience to pay you for your your insights. I wrote a column for 10 years at the Sunday Times, and I've written endless interviews and stuff, so that there are people who are interested in what I've got to say. But now, rather than having to do that through a kind of bundle, which is basically what a newspaper is, and think of something like the Sunday Times, it's, it's Jeremy Clarkson, and it's the news section, and it's, a bit of fashion or whatever. But now you can kind of choose your own bundle. That's really what social media has done. And also you can reach your audience without having to be part of a big bundle. They can come straight to you. And that's why something like Noon is now possible, because you don't need the dead trees and the huge lorries and the distribution to get it into every newsagent. Anybody who's interested can find you, through Instagram or Substack or Twitter or a kind of algorithm. And so you can build your own audience and speak to them unfiltered. And that for me is an absolute revelation after 30 years in the mainstream media, where everything you said was filtered through some kind of ultimate emperor kind of arbiter, usually a man. And if not a man, then a woman who might as well have been a man, because that was why they got the job. And so now I feel this amazing freedom in being able to say what I like to my people without having to get permission to do that from anybody else. That is honestly, feels like a miracle every time I do it.
I can see that, and I can see that direct relationship with the writer is really profound. However, I mean, I've had Susie Boniface on as a guest.
Yeah, I love Susie. I used to do a lot of TV with her, actually, back in the day.
She really defended newspapers, and obviously has an interest in doing so. But as a reporter, tabloid reporter, she's like, actually, with all that freedom and with that direct relationship, there's also, a huge amount of dross and extremist views. And actually, if what newspapers do and what media companies do, like them or loathe them, they curate things that there's a sense.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I'm complaining about. They curate it in a particular kind of way, and Susie is quite an interesting kind of product of that curation. Yeah. So I still write quite a lot in the newspapers, but I know exactly what they want. In terms of what their line is. And so if a right-wing newspaper rings me up and asks me to interview a kind of left-wing politician, and I know that basically they're not going to like my line on them, I say no, because I don't have to do that anymore. Whereas for years, when I was a writer at the Sunday Times, or I had to toe the newspaper line, and it wouldn't go in if you didn't. So the point about the kind of curation is, yes, there's a bit of quality control, but is there really? When you look at like Jeremy Clarkson writing absolute bile around kind of Meghan Markle, I mean, I don't think there is. The newspapers all of them have a particular ideological flavour. And if you don't fit into the flavour that they want, then they don't want you. And none of them are particularly interested in reflecting a kind of an older female demographic, certainly not in the way that the women want to talk about it themselves. So if you think about the way that the media, I used to talk about this a lot. I used to make myself very unpopular in Sunday Times conference, because I would look down the news list and I go, every single woman on this list is a victim, or she's arm candy. Where is the woman with agency doing something in her own right? Or the only stories about women in the business section would be a sea of grey-haired blokes, and then they bung in a picture of a model on the Topshop catwalk to kind of, as they used to say, brighten up the page. So there was a kind of very male lens kind of expectation on kind of women. They like stories about women fighting each other. Most of the female columnists that you'll read will be attacking other women, because that's kind of what the newspapers want them to do. So there's a real, having kind of been inside the belly of the beast for a very long time, I would really disagree kind of with Susie. She's also never been an editor in the way that I have, in terms of what that curation actually excludes.
This podcast is brought to you by Always Possible. But who are we?
Always Possible works with ambitious businesses, charities and public services that are thinking about what's next.
From architects to aerospace companies, puppet theatres to primary schools, business networks to big data analysts.
If you're wanting to be brave with some big decisions, or to be clearer about what to prioritise, then an award-winning workshop from the Always Possible team is a brilliant starting point.
We care about just one thing: building ideas that work.
For creative, intuitive, and practical expertise, consider Always Possible as your strategic partner. Find out more about how we could power up your mission. Visit alwayspossible.co.uk.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
And where do you see this going? What do you think is the logical conclusion of more and more content that people are kind of curating themselves, or it's part of a new style of bundle, in which ultimately you don't need all these big media companies that once upon a time, yes, their flavor would have been quite ideological. Now surely it's only commercial. That more and more are going to do just whatever people pay for.
It's increasingly clickbait.
Yeah.
If you know anything about a story that you read about in one of the papers, you can just see how it's been. You can see how it's been spun. I kind of do that all the time. I quite like looking at the same stories, and because for years I used to read all the different papers all the time. So I'm always interested in the different ways that it's been spun by kind of each one. And often there's absolutely nothing in it, and it's all about spinning the kind of the line that the newspaper's trying to push. And I think the massive demise of their circulations shows that there's much less of an appetite for that, I think. And increasingly, even if you're a journalist, the best way to get your news is to kind of put a news filter on, Google or Twitter or something, and then you'll pick up all the stuff that's interesting. And that's what we used to do, in the newsroom. Yeah, this morning I was looking at the kind of news breaking on the Telegraph, and it was all things that had been said on, I don't know, either on Good Morning Britain or on GB News or on Sky, or a politician popping up on LBC. And that is literally just looking at your Twitter feed if you were just looking at politics. So I think when newspapers can have or have had an impact, I certainly feel proud about some of the big investigations that we did at the Sunday Times, the real big classics, Cash for Questions, the investigation into the World Cup and the corruption in Qatar. And, I think that there are some things that newspapers with big pockets can kind of dig into, but increasingly they're doing less and less of that. And actually, I think, places like the New York Times could do some good stuff, or like the Guardian with the the Bureau of Investigative Journalists, or those kind of collectives of newspapers across the globe when they get a huge cache of documents and really filter through. I mean, that stuff I think is worth having. But I think a lot of what you get in the newspapers is real dross. And maybe in future, what would be better is a kind of mega Substack where you pay for the particular skills of some investigative journalists to go and dig around in things. I mean, maybe that's where we're actually headed. And a lot of the other stuff is quite clickbaity and getting thinner and thinner and thinner as the newspapers. It becomes a cycle of doom. Because the newspapers get thinner, they have less money to put into the investigations, which are actually the thing which are worth having. And those investigations were incredibly expensive and time consuming. You'd have the Insight unit digging away on something maybe for a year, sitting in a room, going through documents, very unglamorous, and then incredibly legally risky and expensive to get into the public domain. So for me, that's the essence of real journalism, is the stuff that someone somewhere really doesn't want you to know, which takes a lot of skill to extract. I'm on the board of something called Reporters Sans Frontières, which is like Médecins Sans Frontières, but for journalists, all over the world. And some of the incredible bravery of journalists and, unraveling cartels in Central America, or standing up to China, or the Iranian regime who are trying to kind of murder journalists kind of all over the world, or what's happened to people who stood up to the regimes in Russia. I mean, those kind of journalists, I think, are real superheroes. Or some of the women who are still inside Afghanistan and trying to get kind of information out. Or that, for me, is the essence of what journalism should be about. But I see so much of our kind of British press being, little better than kind of Twitter clickbait with a bit of extra, maybe anti-Meghan Markle spin or whatever, or kind of. And I think that is really depressing. And that's where the whole kind of media industry does itself a massive disservice. It becomes a kind of gossip kind of carousel with not really very much substance.
your work must be touching people in lots of different ways. It must, I can see the clarity of it is inspiring. So I'm sure there'll be many in the media and outside of it that are feeding back to you kind of what they're seeing in the sort of work that you're doing. How do you measure it? What's your metric of success?
Okay, that's really interesting. Well, one of the metrics of success has been how much can I monetize my stuff on Substack. That's a real kind of thing. So are you serving your community? Are you giving them things that they want? But kind of will they pay for it? And there's nothing more. The other thing that I find really interesting now is things like when I started out running Noon, and it was, I had my kind of little platform, and I put stuff up there, and then I'd put it out on social media. And then I started to see that actually things that had appeared on Noon or had appeared my newsletter from my Substack, which is the newsletter for the Noon community, that actually would get just as much pickup, if not more pickup on LinkedIn, which is a very powerful network, I think, now for this kind of stuff, would get just as much pickup, if not more, than stuff that I'd actually written in a newspaper. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting to me as a kind of a former newspaper executive, because I began to see that old kind of the kind of imprimatur of it having kind of appeared somewhere else, which I thought was necessary, actually wasn't. That people were just as likely to take something that I'd written, kind of for myself on Noon, than something that had appeared, in a broadsheet. And I still do some of that kind of broadsheet journalism because, they pay you or they have access to stuff. And if it's something that appeals to me or serves my other kinds of things that I'm interested in, then I'll do it. But it's not the only way to market. That is the big shift. So when I first started working for the Sunday Times in the news, I started at the Guardian actually in 1993. So 1993, and I was at the Sunday Times, all the way through to 2023. So that's like 30 years. Mm-hmm. And in that time, I saw a massive shift from newspapers being at the centre of the culture, the only way that if you're a politician or a celebrity or a comedian or an author, that you could get your stuff out there. We were the gatekeepers. It was really exciting time to be in media because you really determined what people thought about it. Shaped
the conversation and then the response to it. Yeah.
Yeah, you framed it. You kind of were the ultimate gatekeepers. And so, in 9/11, I was the news review editor of the Sunday Times. So I was in charge of that big broadsheet section, which was basically, what do we think about this stuff? All the stuff is going on. It was the kind of comment and analysis bit. And I remember talking to Andrew Sullivan on the phone and us working out kind of what was going to be the reaction to the attack on the Twin Towers. And he wrote a huge, 5,000 word kind of front cover for us, which was called Why Do They Hate America? Which was trying to unpick why the Twin Towers had been attacked. Yeah. And then that became the kind of prism through which the Today programme reported stuff. All kind of intelligent conversation kind of went back to those pieces that you'd kind of put out there into the public eye. So that was an incredibly kind of heady and powerful and interesting and fun place to be. I mean, really brutal kind of work hours and brutal work culture, but you really felt like you were sitting on the superhighway of the national conversation. So it was really exciting. Whereas now, I mean, even when I left the paper 3 years ago, that had gone. Even those kind of big pieces that you ran just didn't get the same hit, partly because of paywalls, partly because of a much shrinking readership. Then we reckoned that like 5-10 million people were reading the paper every Sunday. Mm-hmm. It's way less than that now. And it just didn't have the hit because now you don't need, if you're Kim Kardashian, you don't need to talk to the Sunday Times or any media outlet. You just go direct to your punters. Mm-hmm. So I think that is the massive shift, is the disappearance of newspapers as those gatekeepers. And much as they might like to think that they're still, important and stirring the conversation, I just don't think that they are in the same way. And you could feel it when you were sitting there that we were all doing the same things and thinking we were still important. But actually, as soon as you got out of it, you realised that nobody was talking about the journalism there at all.
And is that a potential problem for the now multiple platforms and the multiple ways in terms of building a little bit of substance and a kind of brand value? I guess what I mean, and this may be just me and my slightly chaotic brain, but I'm constantly reading things, Substacks. It might be a blog on LinkedIn. It might be a Guardian article. It might be something from the Economist, the New Statesman. It might be something's just, a thread someone's put on Twitter. Now, I won't remember where I read it. Just, did you read that thing? I'll find a link. I'll share it with you, without really often now being conscious of where it came from.
But that's interesting, isn't it? So is there a hierarchy of trust? I suppose that's interesting. I mean, in a way, there is. I often find, and I used to find as a journalist, that some of the most interesting and trustworthy things were, say, like a real expert, like a scientist saying, actually, this is the truth about the stuff that's going on this story. Or that you would find kind of little kind of nuggets, not necessarily in the newspapers. I mean, I think that there's still some really good reporting in. I'm now a subscriber to the New York Times, say, proper bottomed kind of reporting that's going on there, and some checking and all the rest of it. And the same in, and some amazing stuff. I love the New Yorker. I think the Economist has got some great stuff. The FT. We know that there are places that we can go to for, still some proper reporting. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, that whole, you could have read it on the BBC online, but that's now also like a newspaper because everyone's got a website. So it's a great leveler that you now don't have to go out and buy your physical.
And we've not even touched on podcasts, which is a whole new way of telling stories and of doing journalism, and with even fewer constraints of sometimes that print media can sometimes have in terms of.
What I like about podcasts, or actually what I like about Netflix doing Meghan and Harry, is we would never. No newspaper would have run any of that story from Harry about how the newspapers had treated him, because there was a kind of absolute self-censorship about, you never talked about how the media worked. And if anyone wrote that in an article, you'd know to take it out because it wouldn't get into the paper. So after I'd edited something, it would kind of then go through, deputy editor, the editor, and you knew that kind of stuff just wouldn't make it through. So you take it out. So I thought it was really interesting that they'd used kind of that Netflix platform to talk about media. And actually, I think one of the most powerful bits about Harry and Meghan kind of going off to America and doing that is going to be how people think about the tabloid press and the relationship between the palace and the tabloids and the media in this country. Because whatever you think about Harry and Meghan, he has a very compelling critique of how the palace would trade stories. I mean, we know as journalists that's going on all the time. A politician, you've got something on a politician, you want something on someone else, you say, we won't run this if you give us the details on this other thing. I mean, newspapers or media is a constant trade in information. So, when Harry says, oh, well, they would sell me out so the newspapers wouldn't run something nasty about Camilla because they were trying to kind of improve her image because they wanted her to be queen. I mean, that's definitely true. And I think that people now can see that going on. So now when you have the kind of the royal correspondence all, lining up to say, oh, isn't Princess Kate wonderful or whatever, you can see that in action. So I think that the kind of mechanisms and the working of the press, which when it had a monopoly, you could completely, you could hide. It's like the Wizard of Oz, you would stop anyone ever getting behind the curtain. Now, everyone can get behind the curtain because people say it on Twitter, or Harry writes about it in his book, or you can do it in a podcast. There's a whole Netflix kind of outlet that the newspapers have got no control over. So I think that the cat is well and truly out of the bag in that case.
And I know your newsletter and your Substack is a way of being able to explore these different kind of themes in new ways. This is a crass question, but interpreters, what do you want to be famous for beyond being the journalist?
What I really want to, I'm busy writing a book at the moment for a big publisher about all the stuff that I'm talking about Queenagers and about Noon and about these different stories about what's possible for women, at this point. So I'm really interested in, for me, I think one of the most interesting things around at the moment is that we have managed to, as a species, we've managed to extend our life expectancy so massively. It's actually one of the huge achievements of the kind of, the last 100 years that we're all living, twice as long as we used to. But we haven't really worked out what we're going to do with that extra bit of life.
Instructed my children to shoot me at 80. Thank you very much.
Yeah, or maybe not, so, but I think that the way that we're still thinking about our lives is you kind of, you get educated, you do a job, and then you retire. And of course, that's not really true. So what I'm interested in at Noon is this whole thing about how do we transition from one thing that we've done into another, feeling a bit more expansive about our lives, that we've got time. I speak to so many women in their 20s and 30s who just kind of feel like they've got a sell by date and they've got to kind of cram everything in. And I feel really like going, calm down, dears. There is time. You can have if you want to have a family, you can have it younger. You can spend 10 years maybe bumming around the world and learning some languages and kind of working out what it is that you want to do, and then come back and build a career. That we don't need to be fixated on this old model. And so what I'm really trying to do is to make a case for this new bit of life between 50 and 75, where, if you're lucky, you're still pretty sentient and healthy, and you've got kind of a lot going on. And that can really be what I call the age of becoming. Yeah. I talk about 50 as where you become the woman you've always kind of wanted to be. And I see so many women around me really moving into their kind of power in their queen age years and absolutely having a ball. And yet I don't think as a culture we're reflecting that as well, or we're really thinking about what that time can be like, or how there is this extra kind of bit of healthy life now, if you're lucky, where you can do all those things that you always wanted to do when you were younger and you didn't have time. So I'm really arguing for a real re-examination, a reimagining of the whole kind of trajectory of people's lives, and particularly women, because I think that this older bit of women's lives is particularly missing from the culture, that we've just kind of been expected to kind of shut up and go away when men weren't interested in us anymore. And I just don't think that works anymore. And so really what if someone was writing my obituary, there are all sorts of things from what I've done as a journalist, but I hope that what will be in there was, Eleanor, change the story that we tell about the way we value older women, in the same way that now the kind of racist kind of narrative that we grew up with, or the kinds of homosexual jokes that were absolutely the norm when I was at school in the 80s, are now seen as completely beyond the pale, that there will be a whole new story and a sensibility around older women, that you'll never say to someone, oh, you look good for your age, or this whole kind of anti-aging thing will kind of go away, and we'll really embrace all that we are and that we can become at this point.
What a brilliant and optimistic point to close. Really enjoyed talking to you, Eleanor Mills. Thank you very much for being on the Possibility Club.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Possibility Club, Practical Bravery. If you enjoyed this episode, do like, share, review, tell everybody about it. Look in the show notes for all the details of today's guest, stuff we talked about, stuff that's of interest, new things to read, new things to listen to. And if you are running a business or a charity and you are trying to accelerate or improve the impact that you have in the world, if you want to be famous for what you do and what you change rather than just what you sell, then talk to us. alwayspossible.co.uk. We want to hear from you, we want to talk to you, we want to amplify and elevate your ideas, and who knows, we might be able to help you feel more confident and clear about what's next. alwayspossible.co.uk. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with a new special guest and a new insight on practical bravery in action.
The Possibility Club is an Always Possible podcast. The interviewer was Richard Freeman for Always Possible, and the producer and editor was me, Chris Thorpe Tracy, for Lo-Fi Arts. Have a good week.
alwayspossible.co.uk.
Lo-Fi